Modern philosophy has identified three primary categories by which man has come to terms with the immense diversity of the world we find ourselves living in, the external world of nature. These are one, space, time, and number. At the dawn of the human consciousness, when man first became aware of the vastness of not only the terrestrial world he was roaming on, but also the sky and the heavenly bodies therein, it must have led him to wonder about the vast space and the processes going on in that seemingly empty but infinite world. Similarly, his own movement on the earth and the movement of clouds in the sky may have led him to wonder about the time it takes for a body to move from one location to another. And finally, the distances between bodies in space and the time it takes to move around requires some way to measure, and thus we come across number. All these three categories, space, time, and number, can be said to be systems of relations which helps us understand and come to terms with nature. What we are talking about is the first encounters and experiences of mankind with space and time. Today, conventionally, we consider both space and time as continuous, abstract, homogeneous, and infinite categories. But primitive man was not capable of abstracting the concept of space from the actual experience of space. Most likely, the beginning of spatial and temporal consciousness is akin to that of a newborn baby who opens her eyes to a jumble of impressions, whereby things and people are not yet distinguishable from one another. What she first sees is a kind of a visual soup in which everything merges into each other and there is no distinction between objects and people, objects and space between them. It is only when these sensory impressions are reworked into specific formed representations, into images, that comprehension can be said to have begun. This process is called objectivization, in which objects, that is bodies, are articulated and their positions established in space. Centuries later, many cultures such as Greek, Chinese, Indian, and Moorish Arabic, at the height of their cultural and intellectual sophistication, developed concepts and representations to understand and integrate this essential unity and diversity in their worldview. For example, Chinese developed the concept of yin-yang. Yin-yang depicts opposing yet coexisting complementary and interconnected qualities in a phenomenon. Since, like yin and yang, space and objects are also created together in a single moment, they are bound together as parts of a mutual whole. The space object is a dynamic equilibrium. This binary of space object and their common boundary is beautifully represented in the Moorish capital of Granada in Spain. In the royal bath within the Alhambra Palace complex at Granada, we find several beautifully conceived and executed marble inlay graphic patterns that speak of this reciprocity of space and object. Here, object is represented by geometric shapes a stylized equilateral triangle, or even a more complex polygon, repeated many times in different colors and joined with each other at the corners. The white background represents the space. This is a classic example of the figure-ground duality. But a closer examination reveals that the space between the objects has the same geometric shape and thus the boundary as the objects. If the corners where the figures touch each other are seen as a fulcrum and the figures are rotated 60 degrees or 90 degrees, they occupy the adjoining white spaces precisely. In other words, the ground is as figural as the figure. Like yin and yang, space and objects too are complementary and mutually interdependent. The early man's initial confrontation with natural geography may have engendered the initial articulation of spatial relations. For example, a settlement by the side of a hilly range may have led to a judgment of the settlement being on one side of a wall-like range, or something else being on the other side. Similarly, being in a crater or in a forest with thick tree cover may have given a sense of enclosure. This perception of space is specific only to the person who is experiencing it. It is not abstract, free of any reference, as there would be in pure empirical thought of science. It is anchored and reference to our bodies and specific to each one of us. For example, if you are standing on my left, the same cannot be said if the reference changes from me to you. I am on your right. Similarly, when we attribute size, position, and distance to things in space, we are not expressing simple sensations, but are situating the sensory data in relation to our own self. The distances are to be measured not in the abstract unit of feet and meters, by the number of paces anything is away from our body standing on its 2 feet on the ground. The space stretches away in all directions with our body at the center. This is called body in orientation, and it is at the basis of all ancient civilizations' initial formulation of place or location, which at once identifies each place or a location as distinct from all the others. It is necessary here to make a distinction that between the space of perception and the abstract absolute space, which has in modern times acquired the position of the normative conception of space, not only in science, but also in every other field, including architecture. While the space of perception carried an element of inevitability about itself, as it was founded on the basis of actual experience. After all, we cannot not perceive. Perception is integral to life. The absolute space, on the other hand, also known as the Euclidean space, like the one represented here as a simple cube defined by 8 vertices and 12 lines, is without context and is independent and pre-existing of man and his experiences. The former is an organic and psychologically simpler concept, at the core of which is the concept of place. Place is the pure product of perception. and experience with material and measurable qualities like an object. It is accessible for immediate comprehension through our sense organs. A place then can never be imagined as empty, in the sense that the experience of its occupation is integral to its perception. We can never imagine ourselves without being in a place, being impressed. In fact, place is so much effect of our daily normal experiences that it has been taken for granted as not worthy of conscious inquiry. However, throughout the last 2 centuries, our architectural discourse has been centered around the concept of abstract space. And such a space conception has been integral with the notion of a universal architectural modernism, resulting in unanchored architecture and the placelessness of our environment. Only recently, place has entered into our vocabulary as the new revived search for a sense of place. Sense of place. How did we get here? Like many things we have seen in this series, this also has its origin in philosophy and science. Men's inquiries about the external world, physical world, we have inherited. René Descartes had already declared in the early 16th century that sense perception is not reliable in giving us the true picture of reality. It was Isaac Newton who in 1687 announced that space is distinct from matter and is absolute and contrary to our experiences. This is contrary to our experiences, not given to sense perception. But what about the experiences we already have? We experience every day. In order to account for these experiences, Newton also assigned space a dual structure, absolute and relative. One being true and mathematical, and the other apparent and accessible to sense perception. But how do we perceive this relative space? Newton answered this by introducing an abstract tool. This is what he said, and I quote, "But because the parts of space cannot be seen or distinguished from one another by our senses, therefore in their state we use sensible measure." Sensible measure, remember this. Sensible measure for them. For from the positions and distances of things, from any body considered as immovable, we define all places. And then with respect to such places, we estimate all motions considering bodies as transferred from some of these places into others, unquote. This sensible measure that Newton was talking about is the coordinate system of X, Y, and Z that we commonly use to describe spatial objects and which was first introduced by Descartes. Though a three-dimensional object was conceived as far back as 300 BC, its language of description was pure geometry as laid down by Euclid, the Greek mathematician of Alexandria. It is generally referred to as the Euclidean geometry. But it was not until the 16th century that René Descartes first came up with the idea of three spatial coordinates to anchor the static Euclidean space with respect to a reference. Thus, The Cartesian system is Euclidean space, but with coordinates. The Cartesian coordinate system unified geometry and algebra into one system of analytical geometry. Newton simply extended this notion of coordinate systems to substantiate and make sensible this relative space. Thus, we have two distinct and mutually incompatible space conceptions. One, the kinetic space of perception, anchored with the idea of place and defined not by a system of abstract coordinates, but wherein the place is a positional quality of the object it is a place of, and therefore not independent of what it holds. Kinetic because its physicality itself is contingent upon the object, or more precisely, the human body, which can move and therefore cause changes in the qualitative configuration of the place itself. I'm in this room, and the space in this room is distinguished with my presence at this location. If I move around, the qualitative configuration of the space changes as I move around. It is not the same as it was. This is particularly relevant in architecture, as we shall see soon. And the second conception of space is the space as container of all material objects. In case of the first conception of space, the space of perception, space and the material objects or our body are integral, and it's inconceivable to think about space without objects or bodies. While in the case of the second conception, the Euclidean space, material objects can only be conceived as existing in space. Just as in the last session, we saw the pyramid and the Greek temple as objects in space. Space is seen as the container of these objects. But the space as a reality is independent of the material world. The history of philosophy and science, especially in the West, is a story of this oscillation between these two conceptions of space. Let me illustrate the kinetic space of perception with two examples. One of earliest use of sense of space can be seen in the way people have measured and mapped the earth or parts of it, map making, cartography. Today, we use latitude and longitude with a fixed reference point to represent the space of the entire earth. This cartography came into being in the 17th century. Before the development of this global mapping with latitude and longitude and a fixed reference, the ocean voyagers and traders used charts that connected significant trading ports or events in their journey, which may not correspond to harbors or the coastlines. Animated by compass or windroses and crisscrossing rum lines showing the direction of the winds or compass points, these Portolan charts show the importance of knowledge of winds and local ports to the marine trade. Meticulously drawn city profiles, often sporting the city's colors, offer a glimpse into the bustling landscape of the trade. The charts also show the world imagined by the chart makers, with lions, elephants, and extravagantly clothed inhabitants which populate the charts. Cartography then is an important tool in our investigation, as it not only represents spatial information, but also in the process of doing so, tells us about what constituted the significant spatial events identified by the place, identified by a place. For the cartographer, and thus the very notion of the space, animated by a sense of place. At the time when the maps were drawn, it was a place or places perceived and experienced, and not space measured with respect to a fixed reference. Each compass points on the map represents the center of a polar grid. And in this case, the analog for the eye of the sailor. The point where all the lines meet is where the sailor stood. So that is a very specific place for him. Unlike our contemporary maps, with an orthogonal grid of longitude and latitude and a fixed singular reference point at the pole, these maps represent a world space of multiple reference points radiating across 180-degree arc in all directions, connecting other compass points or ports and trading posts of significance. It is a many-centered world. In 1597, Philip d'Anfray had invented the graphometer for taking sightings from several vantage points to accurately survey the Earth's surface. These land surveyors had one thing in common with the nautical navigators. As the surveyor moves from one vantage point to the next, he makes sure that all the vantage points after the first one are places which have already been sighted from some other point. And as he adopts a new vantage point, he adjusts the instrument to match the previous reading. The reference point always remains relative to the terrestrial space being measured. All the above examples of attempts to measure the Earth illustrate the kinetic space of perception in operation prior to the geometric Euclidean space gaining supremacy. Both show that while measuring the Earth, man never left the surface of the Earth. Neither did the navigator on the surface of the ocean. He or his body was the center and the moving reference point. Is Euclidean space then a direct extension or a development of the perceptual space? What are the attributes of Euclidean space? How do we distinguish it from the perceptual space? The philosopher Ernst Cassirer denies any relationships or connection between the two and also makes a very important point. And I quote, "It is self-evident that the space of perception, the space of vision and touch, does not coincide with the space of pure mathematics, that there is indeed a thoroughgoing diversity between the two. The determination of the mathematical space do not follow simply from those of the sensory space. On the contrary, we require a peculiar reversal of perspective, a negation of what seems immediately given in sensory perception before we can arrive at the logical space of pure mathematics," unquote. In other words, in conformity with René Descartes' rejection of the reliability of senses, we have now rejected that which is most natural to us, that is perception. Cassirer then goes on to list three basic attributes of Euclidean space: continuity, infinity, and homogeneity. That is a good place to start. But then immediately we realize that all these qualities answer to one overarching master attribute. They are all independent and outside the bodily experiences of man. There lies the source of the antithetical relationship between the two conceptions of space. All these qualities can never be attributed to the visual and tactile space of perception. The very fact that our faculties of perception, visual, tactile, smell, etc., all residing in our bodies and are confined within a certain spatial limit surrounding our bodies, make the concept of infinity alien to the space of perception. We can see only up to a certain distance. We can touch only up to a certain distance. Our hands cannot move beyond that. Our sense of smell also is confined to it. They all give us an envelope, which is limited to the qualities or the capacities of the body. And therefore, the space of perception can never have an infinite quality. Similarly, homogeneity or uniformity also can never be attributed to perception. Let us look again at this simple geometric cube made up of 8 vertices, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, joined together by 12 lines, which inscribe a space, a cubical space. The basis of homogeneity of this space is that all the vertices which are joined in it determine only their respective position in relation to each other and have no independent meaning of their own outside of these relations. As Cassirer put it, and I quote, "Because fundamentally these points are devoid of all content, because they have become mere expressions of ideal relations, they can raise no question about a diversity of content. Their homogeneity signifies nothing other than this similarity of structure grounded in their common logical function, their common ideal purpose and meaning," unquote. In contrast to the visual and textile space of perception, which is inhomogeneous and where the main directions of organization, that is before, behind, above, below, right, left, are dissimilar, the Euclidean space as represented by this cube can never be given. It can only be produced by cerebral construction and available to us through representation. But being independent and outside the body also implies that it can be represented abstractly so that it can be received equally by others universally. But the experience of perception is always unique to the one who perceives it and cannot be universalized. Being bodily there as part of the place is a precondition for our sense of place. Thus, conceiving architectural space as geometric space makes it possible to represent it through a universal language of drawings, a system of notations which are universally recognizable. Nowhere in the space of perception can this possibility be fulfilled. But it has left much of our architecture without experiential qualities. These two space conceptions are so antithetical to each other that it makes no sense to think that one is a logical extension of the other through evolution. The space of geometry is a space conceived by the mind of man, independent of the body, while the space of perception presupposes the unity or rather non-duality of the subject and the object. Space, the object of perception, and the perceiving subject, us, are intertwined in a single unbroken whole, like yin and yang. This points to the fundamental crisis of analytical thought, and it is embedded in the original separation between the reality as the object of reflection and the reflecting consciousness as the subject, us, the separation between the observer and the observed, or the mind and the body. But there is a way out of this dilemma. Many ancient civilizations have resolved this by conceiving a third conception of space. Cassirer has called it mythical space, which lies somewhere between the space of geometry, with which it shares the cerebral qualities, and the space of perception, with which it shares the sensuous bodily engagement. It can only be experienced by us being there, one with it. In other words, it is co-made, jointly made by the physicality of the place or the architecture and the perceiving subject for whom the meanings are embedded in that space. Here, Ernst Cassirer makes another very important point. Position is not something that can be detached from content or contrasted with it as an element of independent significance. It is only insofar as it is filled with a definite individual, sensuous, or intuitive content. Hence, in sensory as in mythical space, no here and there is a mere here and there. A mere term in a universal relation which can occur identically with the most diverse contents. Every point, every element possesses rather a kind of tonality of its own. Each element has a spatial distinguishing character, which cannot be described in general concepts, but which is immediately experienced as such. Simply put, what Cassirer is asking is, what if each of the 8 vertices of the cube we saw earlier have a specific distinguishing character and meaning distinct from that of the others, and which we can experience? What if architecture is made with such places and positions? In fact, such spaces have been created and exist today for us to experience. One, though it depicts a 2-dimensional pictorial space, is a large fresco in the Ajanta caves dating back to 2nd or 3rd century BC in Maharashtra, India. It depicts a story of a sage, Vidura Pandita, believed to be a reincarnation of Lord Buddha. The linear narrative of this story describes events taking place in all 3 worlds, that is heaven, earth, and the underworld, the entire cosmic space, with characters moving back and forth between them. But the artist and the art historian, Dr. Ratan Parimu's study shows the pictorial representation of this otherwise verbal narrative is non-linear in the pictorial space and simultaneous, as if all the events are taking place within the singular pictorial space and at once. To see the cosmic space as a tripartite structure with clearly defined position as heaven, earth, and the underworld is clearly the work of a scientific mind, which must view reality as made up of its component parts. Classical analytical thinking, a trait it shares with the geometric space. But true deep consciousness perceives the reality as an unbroken wholeness, where both space and time are condensed as a singularity, and where the observer becomes part of the phenomenon to be observed. Clearly, the painter has conceived the painting in his consciousness, and even when it is brought out and placed outside the limit of his body on the walls of the cave, the inseparability of space and the self, artists as well as ours now as we see it, remains. For the vanishing point, actually there is no such thing as vanishing point because there is no perspective in the classical sense. But for the sake of brevity, we shall use this expression to make a point. The vanishing point is not on the other side of the picture plane, but within ourselves. We never leave the place. We never leave the space. It is the abode of our consciousness. For the depiction of such a space in architecture, let me take you to Bhaktapur in Nepal. The sacred space of the city is inscribed by 8 shrines, temples, dedicated to 8 mother goddesses, each one dedicated to one of the 8 mother goddesses, Ashtamatrika. These are Mother Brahmani, Chamunda, or also known as Siddhikali, Vaishnavi, Maheshwari, Indrani, Komari, Varahi, and finally Narasimhi. Legend has it that God Vishnu commanded the Matrikas, normally associated with destructive energy, to protect the world instead of destroying it, and thus be worshipped by the mankind. In this urban space, these shrines, each representing one of the 8 cardinal points of the cosmic space, are in effect the vertices describing the space. Each shrine has a story, a myth associated with the deity, and thus each vertex has a content, as Kasirar is asking for. These also form the path of circumambulation, which a devotee bodily traverses, and in the process recreating the myth, making their position integral with their content. Just as the devotee at Ajanta is, while moving from one event to the other in the painting, inscribes a space. The circuit of the circumambulation, connecting all shrines, makes a mythical envelope, like an invisible dome, surrounding and protecting the city. This is not the space of geometry, abstract and to be contemplated upon through cerebral distance, but one to be bodily engaged and co-made by the physicality of the shrine's location in geographical terrain, the meanings and the myth embedded in each shrine or temple, and the reenactment of the composite myth of Ashtamatrikas by the devotees walking with their feet firmly on the ground. It is finite and grounded on a specific location on the earth and cannot be replicated. Each vertex or a shrine or a temple is distinct from the other, both in terms of the specific location and also the diversity of stories they all carry. Unlike the vertices of the Euclidean cube, which are without content and meaning, each shrine temple embodies meaning distinct from that of the other. However, such transformation is not limited to pre-rational examples, such as Bhaktapur, Ajanta, or Karnak in Egypt, where the reading of the space is contingent upon the movement of the devotee or the participant and her interaction with the objective architecture. Though communication through symbolic forms and the resultant conversation between architecture and the human participant was far more prevalent in the pre-rational societies, more recent examples are also available and indicate that architecture has always been involved in symbolic communication. In our own so-called high rational societies in which we live in, one does come across examples when dynamic architectural spaces have been created by engaging us in a conversation with the new icons of our own era. One such example that comes to mind is the US Pavilion at Montreal World Fair in 1967, designed by Buckminster Fuller and Cambridge 7 Associates. The building was a simple geodesic dome containing a series of platforms at various levels, connected with stairs and escalators. The entire volume of the spherical space was filled with a series of objects or images which represented the prevalent myth of the United States in the mid-20th century. This was the time when the US had captured the imagination of the world with both its soft power, that is the Hollywood, pop art, etc., as well as the technological achievements of conquering the space. Thus, we see icons such as Marlon Brando, Marlene Dietrich, the ubiquitous yellow cab of New York, Andy Warhol, and also the lunar landing craft and the spaceship. These symbolize the myth of America in the 1960s. The space is made and remade for each visitor by her movement through the space and the relationship or conversation, as it were, she may establish with these icons. Conversation of familiarity, pride, joy, awe, or envy. If you happen to be a Soviet citizen, you might envy. Yes. In this sense, her movement through this space is not much different from that of the observer at Ajanta, Bhaktapur, or Karnak. The images collectively represented the United States at that time, and to that extent, it was spiritual. It was independent from the spherical volume contained by the dome. In fact, both acted as counterpoint of each other. This space presupposes the presence of the human visitor. In fact, it loses all meaning in the absence of the human presence. For each of these images and icons embody meanings that are encrypted in the cultural ethos and can be revealed only through an active engagement of people in space. The icon, image, object, space, and the moving observer assume uniformity, as if they are all made of the same substance, like a three-dimensional mesh, assuming various forms but connecting all in consciousness. The movement of the observer constantly alters the relationship between the image icon and the observer. If the dance of the moving observer is a motion in space, architecture thus is space in motion, a kinetic space. All over the world and in every society throughout history, people seek to construct stories and myths that make sense of the diversity of their world. The impulse is both romantic and practical, and every narrative is a simplification of individual events that are stitched together to constitute the larger myth of the culture. Architecture thus becomes the totem pole, as it were, of the culture to project the narratives through visual form. The iconography may differ between Ajanta, Bhaktapur, Karnak in Egypt, or US Pavilion at Montreal, but the space remains similar. In all cases, the observer is an integral part of the phenomenon to be observed. The events, objects, or the images constitute the vertices that describe the space. The distinction between the subject and the object is overcome. Architecture is co-made by the physicality of the built form and the human presence emplaced as an integral part of it. Not contained in it, it's integral part of it. This offers us a tentative sketch of a possible alternative conception of space in architecture. Theory is sublimation of experience, and let us accept that the architectural experiences throughout history and in all parts of the world have always dealt with a far more complex space than what we have theorized so far.